Good morning, Year 5. Right, here we go then. Our last instalment of The Demon Headmaster. Looking forward to seeing a lot of you next week, albeit only for 2 days, but it'll be nice to get back, won't it? But we better get on and finish our final book, The Demon Headmaster, Chapter 15, The Great School Quiz. Lloyd slumped in his chair at the front of the hall, watched as the two teams filed out. The stage was a disgusting mess. Bits of spaghetti, broken eggs and torn paper lay all over the floor. On Dinah's chair lay one of the huge scarlet pepper pots which Eddie Hare had used in his fight with the spaghetti. Lloyd saw Dinah pick it up and put it on the table in front of her, while the headmaster, with an expression of revulsion, kicked away a squashed banana from near his foot. "Unbelievable, isn't it?" Eddie Hare said cheerfully. "The country must be in a mess when a show like this is so popular." He began to explain the rules of the quiz. 10 questions for each team with 30 seconds to answer, if you can. Dinah sat in her chair with her hands clasped on the table in front of her. On her face was an expression of complete and total wretchedness. "It's worse for her than it is for us," Lloyd thought suddenly. "We've only got to wait, but she's got to help him win." He felt a sudden burst of pity for her and was surprised at himself. Was he getting soft? "Right," Eddie Hare reached for the question paper. "Manor Road School first, and it's a real brain buster. King Zonk of Zoldovia has 100 children. 90% of them have curly noses, 85% of them are bald, 80% of them have one leg, and 75% of them lisp. How many bald, one-legged, lisping children with curly noses must he have?" "Wow," thought Lloyd. But Alec Bates was ready, smiling confidently and scribbling on the paper in front of him. A moment later he answered, 30. "Right," yelled Eddie Hare. "And how pretty their holiday snaps must look. 1 point to Manor Road. Next question to the home team, and here it is. Every room in my house has as many old women in as there are rooms altogether. Every old woman knits as many knee-warmers as there are rooms. I share the knee-warmers out among 7 of my worst enemies, giving each the same number, and as many as possible, and I still have more than enough to cover my knees. How many have I got?" Dinah picked up the red pepper pot in front of her and stared thoughtfully at its black stripes, but she didn't bother to write anything down. 6, she said in an unhappy voice. The headmaster gave a pleased smile as the scores drew level, and Lloyd felt a cold shudder creep up his back. Only another 9 questions each, and if they were no more trouble than that one, how could Dinah help winning? But he had not counted on Alec Bates. Alec was the only one of the Manor Road team who seemed to have any brains at all, but he was crammed with them. Every time Eddie Hare asked him a question, he gave the same conceited grin and scribbled away furiously on his piece of paper. And every time his answers were right. When the score stood at 8-8, Lloyd suddenly realised that it could be a draw. What would happen then? The headmaster had obviously realised that too. He was frowning and staring at Alex as the next question was asked, as if he were willing him to fail. "Right smart, Alec," Eddie Hare said with sarcastically. "How about this one? I have a certain number made up entirely of 7s, 1 7 after another, and I can divide it by 199. I want you to give me the last 4 figures of the answer, but, and here's the catch, folks, I'm not going to tell you how many 7s make up the number." Alex stared at him. Eddie Hare didn't say anything else, just turned and looked at the big clock behind him, where the second hand was ticking around from 30 to 0. 5 seconds left, he said at last. "Come on, genius. What's the answer?" I don't know," Alex said as the bell sounded. He did not sound embarrassed, only furious. "And the score is still 8-8. Eddie Hare jumped off his barrel and turned a quick cartwheel. "Goodness me, the excitement's mounting here. What about our genius? Will she be able to answer her question?" Dinah looked at him, white-faced, and beside her the headmaster smiled triumphantly. She gripped the pepper pot hard between her hands until the knuckles showed white, and glanced across at Lloyd and Harvey, Mandy and Ingrid. When she answered the question, Lloyd could almost feel her reluctance. The score was 9-8 to them now. My, Eddie Hare looked out over the hall and then raised his eyebrow at the headmaster. "What a quiet lot of children you have here. It's the first time your team has gone into the lead. Why aren't they cheering?" The headmaster shrugged. "They can cheer if you want them to." He raised a hand, and instantly, obediently, all the children in the hall started to cheer loudly and enthusiastically. Then he dropped his hand, and they stopped, all at once. Eddie Hare gave him an odd look. "That's remarkably well organised. I've never seen a school like it before." He grinned at the camera. baring his uneven yellow teeth. "It's a good thing these bossy teachers don't run the country, isn't it, folks? They'd have us all doing just what they want, like robots, and where would I be then?" He chortled merrily, but the headmaster's face gave a sullen, irritated twitch. And all at once Lloyd understood. That was it. That was what the headmaster wanted, to run the whole country so that it was as organised and joyless as the school, so that everything was neat and tidy and there was no freedom. He looked frantically at Dinah, wishing there was some way he could tell her. But as his eyes met hers, he knew that there was no need to tell her. She had understood too. Her mouth had dropped open and her eyes were stretched wide in complete horror. As the cameras turned towards the Manor Road team waiting for their next question, she began to mouth furiously at Lloyd. "That's what the prefects were talking about," she said soundlessly. "He's got them all set up to move people into work camps and—" Her mouthing became faster and more desperate, and Lloyd lost track of what she was saying, but he didn't need to know any more. It was too terrible even to think about. It would be like having school everywhere with no escape. The headmaster had seen her too. He frowned and pointed down the hall, straight at the members of Splat. Then he looked at Dinah, his eyebrows raised in a question. Miserably, she shook her head. Lloyd could just imagine how trapped she was feeling. Now she knew what the plan was, she could still do nothing to stop it, not without killing them all. And there was not much time left. Alec had answered his last question and was grinning again. "So the score is 9-9, Eddie Hare said. He ran his fingers through his curls. "The tension is killing me. Will it be a draw? Everything hangs on the last question." Lloyd looked anxiously at Dinah. She was gripping the pepper pot so hard that he wondered it didn't crack, and she looked as though she was going to burst into tears. "So," Eddie Hare bellowed, "here we go, and it's a complicated one, so listen carefully. I woke up and found I'd travelled back in time. I didn't know what year it was, so I asked a man who was walking past. He told me, if you multiply my age now by twice my age next birthday, you will get the number of the year we are in, and I can tell you that I don't remember Queen Victoria, but I hope to live to the year 2000. Got it? Tell how old this book is." Dinah nodded. She was just about to open her mouth to give the answer, but before she spoke, she looked across at Lloyd. And he knew that he could not let her do it, even if it meant being killed. The idea of having the whole country run by the headmaster forever was too horrible. Frantically, he shook his head over and over until it felt as though it would fall off his neck. Dinah shut her mouth again. "Come on," Eddie Hare looked at the clock. "You can have a clue if you like. You only score half a point then, but that's enough to let you win. Do you want the clue?" "Give it to her," the headmaster said sharply. He was looking incredulously at Dinah. "The clue is this." Eddie Hare looked down at his piece of paper. "By the way," the man added, "I'm not quite as old as my cousin Winston Smith. Got it?" Dinah nodded sadly, as though that fitted in with what she'd thought, but she didn't say anything. Glaring at her, the headmaster looked down at the children in the hall and cleared his throat as if he were about to speak. Lloyd braced himself. Here it came. The end. "Sorry, H," he thought. "I couldn't protect you after all. This is more important." Then, from the other side of Dinah came an excited yelp. Lucy, who had sat silently in her chair all through the quiz, was bouncing up and down. "I know the answer," she yelled. "I know it. Winston Smith's the name of that man in that funny book you told me about, Dinah. It's 1984. "That's the right answer," Eddie Hare said gleefully. "Well done, Titch, you've saved the day." As the giant panda appeared behind the chair of Manor Road's headmaster, Lloyd began to shake uncontrollably. Their own headmaster had reached up and taken off his glasses, ready for his turn to speak. In Chapter 16, Look into My Eyes. "That's dealt with the losers," said Eddie Hare cheerfully, as the headmaster of Manor Road tried to unwind the eels that the giant panda had tipped over his head. "Now, how about the winners? A fantastic performance, not a question missed. Now it's your turn, headmaster. Our viewers are ready to vote. Can you talk yourself out of trouble?" With a feeling of sick defeat, Dinah saw the cameras swivel, pointing towards the headmaster. He smiled into them, his large green eyes alight, and said softly, "If you look into my eyes, I will tell you. You must be feeling ready for some sense after all the craziness of this show. You must be longing to have everything sorted out tidily, everything settled for you." Forever, thought Dinah, forever and ever. Oh, how could she stop what was going to happen? If she didn't, life would never be worth living again. But if she tried, it would mean death for everyone else in Splat. She could see Lloyd leading sideways now, whispering to them, explaining what was about to take place, and as they understood, they all gasped. "You're all feeling exhausted by the mess," the headmaster was saying to the camera, "tired and weary, and ready to sleep." Through her misery, Dinah felt the familiar sleepiness start to creep over her, and all over the country, people sitting in front of their televisions began to nod over their cups of tea, wondering why they were suddenly yawning. You can hardly keep your eyes open. With every second that passes, your eyelids are growing heavier and heavier. Millions of cups of tea in homes everywhere dropped to the ground, unheeded as people slumped forwards in their chairs. In the hall, the audience nodded and Dinah's eyes began to close. She struggled hard to keep them open, but the lids drooped irresistibly. Then, just before they finally shut, she saw Harvey leap to his feet. He was pointing straight at her, pointing at the table in front of her. Muzzily, she looked at his lips, trying to see what he was mouthing. If only she didn't feel so tired. Harvey wagged his finger, pointing in a frenzy, and at last she managed to make out what it was that he was saying. "In your hand." Funny, she thought sleepily. Why was he interested in her hand? She looked down, forcing her eyes to stay open for a second longer. Oh, yes, she thought vaguely. She was still clutching that silly red pepper pot with the black stripes. So sleepy. She gave a huge, exhausted yawn. Pepper, she thought. Then, Pepper! That was it! Dragging together all the energy she could muster, she forced herself agonisingly to her feet, wrenched the bottom off the pepper pot and flung the contents as hard as she could straight into the headmaster's face. Then she sank back onto her chair, knowing that she couldn't do anything more to resist that creeping, soothing voice. But what happened to the voice? It had stopped. For a moment there was silence, and she turned her head slowly sideways. The headmaster had gone purple in the face, his lips pressed tightly together, his green eyes bulging ludicrously. As she watched, his mouth was forced uncontrollably open in an enormous, a stupendous sneeze. Achoo! As though the strength of the sneeze had blown away her sleepiness, Dinah suddenly found herself wide awake. Right across the country, people in easy chairs sat up, looked in bewilderment at the spilt tea on their carpets, and started to vote. In the hall, everyone stirred and gazed in amazement at the sneezing headmaster. His nose streamed, his mouth gaped ridiculously as his head jerked backwards and forwards. Achoo! 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 And then a cascade of spaghetti fell onto his head. From all over the hall, unbelievably, came the sound of laughter. All the children were laughing at the headmaster. Dinah could see the powerless rage in his eyes, but he could do nothing to stop them. From time to time he tried to speak. He managed to stutter out dis, in an effort to give his command to destroy the straw dolls, but every time he got as far as that, another huge sneeze overtook him, and he collapsed. Eddie Hare was gazing at him ecstatically, as if a sneezing headmaster was what he'd always wanted on his show. Raising his voice, he said above the noise of the sneezes and the laughing, "Well, folks, beat that if you can for a way to run a school. You know what I always say about this show? You never know what's going to happen next." As the final music began, he winked at the audience and cartwheeled away across the stage. The headmaster was just beginning to be able to control his sneezes. He pulled a spotless handkerchief out of his pocket, mopped his face, and glared at Dinah with total hatred. "Do you realise what you've done, you stupid girl?" he gasped. "You have destroyed this country's chance of becoming the first properly organised, truly efficient country in the world." "No, I haven't," she said happily. "I've saved it from being a miserable place full of scared robots like this school, and I'm going to think of a way of saving the school from you as well." "The school?" The headmaster jumped to his feet and waved a scornful hand at the rows of giggling children. "That rabble! Do you think, that I want to go on wasting my talents merely looking after them when you've made a laughingstock of me? Achoo! I resign at once, and I'll let them all sink back into chaos." "What are you going to do then?" Dinah said quietly. He stood over her, glaring down. For a moment she was afraid that he was actually going to strangle her in front of everyone. His large hands jerked and his face was a mask of rage. Then he took a deep breath and an unpleasant smile spread across his lips. "Do you think I'd be so foolish as to tell you my plans? No, Miss Clever Glass, you must find them out for yourself, if you are clever enough. You've defeated me this time, but I know I was meant for greatness. I shall succeed in the end." With a loud, scornful laugh, he stalked off the stage and began to stride down the hall between the chairs. As his black-clad figure went by, the children stopped laughing and glanced fearfully at him. He didn't look either to the right or to the left, but past them like a tall shadow. Halfway down the hall, he stopped suddenly, his body shaking. Ha, 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 choo! As if they had been released from a spell, the children began to giggle again, and Lloyd and Harvey grinned happily up at Dinah, while Ian, Mandy and Ingrid jumped up and danced a jig. But Dinah didn't grin back. She found that her hands were trembling, and she followed the headmaster with her eyes, all the way until the hall door closed behind him. "How did the show go?" Mrs. Hunter said, opening the door. "We were going to watch it, of course, but I'm afraid we had a visitor." "It was fabulous, marvellous," Lloyd said jubilantly, bouncing into the house. "Can you save it?" his mother said, frowning slightly. "We want you all to come into the sitting room. There's something we've got to talk to you about. Then you can tell us all about it." Lloyd winked at Dinah behind his mother's back. "She'd get a shock if we did, wouldn't she?" he mouthed. Dinah winked back happily and walked into the sitting room and stopped abruptly. There on the settee was Miss Wilberforce, looking solemn. "Hello, Dinah." "Hello, Miss Wilberforce," Dinah said in a cold little voice. Miss Wilberforce sighed and looked at Mr. and Mrs. Hunter. "I'm afraid you're right," she said. "It doesn't look as if she feels at all at home, and I was so sure she'd feel happy and relaxed here." "I don't think it's her fault," Mrs. Hunter said sternly. "I blame the boys." Lloyd stared round at them. "What do you mean? What are you all talking about?" "We're talking about Dinah." Mr. Hunter smiled apologetically at her. "Mrs. Hunter and I like having you here, dear. We've grown fond of you, but you don't seem to get on with the boys. You've been at each other's throats all the time, haven't you? So we've agreed with Miss Wilberforce that it would be better for everyone if you just went back to the children's home." Dinah felt as though someone had hit her with a large lump of very cold ice. Her face stiffened. "Yes, Mr. Hunter," she said in a small voice. "But you can't," burst out Harvey. He stopped and looked helplessly at Lloyd. Lloyd sat down deliberately in a chair and looked round at the grown-ups. "I think you're all mad," he said loudly. "Why would you ever want to send Dinah away? Plum-coloured pumpkins, we want her here for ever and ever. I think Mum and Dad ought to adopt her properly." Mr. and Mrs. Hunter goggled, their mouths dropping open. You like her?" "Well, of course," Lloyd said, as if it were a ridiculous question. "I think she's fantastic. Except," he grinned across at her, "except for being a bit thick, of course." Dinah had gone rather pink and was staring at her feet. She didn't speak until Miss Wilberforce said gently, "Well, Dinah, how do you feel about it?" In a choking voice, as though she could hardly speak, Dinah said, "Please, oh, please." "Oh, that's all right then," Lloyd said in a satisfied tone. "Now, please can we have something to eat? We're all absolutely starving." His mother looked at him in bewilderment. "But you took a packed tea to school. You can't be hungry again. Whatever have you been up to?" Lloyd, Harvey and Dinah looked at each other and grinned. "Oh, nothing much," they said in perfect unison. And that's it. That's the end of The Demon Headmaster. If that's grabbed your interest and you'd like to read the others, there are that many books in the series. And the next one is called The Demon Headmaster and the Prime Minister's Brain. Okay, guys, well, I've really enjoyed reading to you for 3 crazy, crazy months. Thank you for being with me on this journey and for all the brilliant hard work you've done. And I will see a lot of you next week.